You are in for a wonderful treat with Anne. She is going to be talking about understanding genetics and the Duchenne spectrum. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you, Rachel. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So like Rachel was saying, I'm a genetic counselor, and I feel a little bad following Rachel Callender and her lovely presentation because I'm going to be the evil person talking about a lot of medical terminology. So I'm just going to apologize now and try to make it as family friendly as possible. And this really is, you know, a or 101 talk, a very basic talk on Duchenne and Becker, just to give some of the newly diagnosed families here an opportunity to kind of review the basics, because you're going to hear a lot about some really heavy science. So I think it's a nice way to kick off the meeting to just get down some basics. So, and I'll talk about genetics and the importance of genetic testing, and then how we can help you connect to research if you're interested through our Duchenne Registry, and then of course answer any questions that you have. So I feel like this is a silly slide for this group because you all know what Duchenne is now, but I realize there might be some family members here, so it's always nice to go over the basics. But Duchenne and Becker are muscular dystrophies, and they're caused by problems within a gene that makes the dystrophin protein, and that gene is called the Dmd gene. And so because of the changes within that gene, the dystrophin protein is either not made at all or it's made incorrectly. And without that protein, the muscles really aren't able to function or repair themselves as they should. So this is a little bit of a complicated picture, but I just wanted to point out here that Duchenne and Becker, you're often going to hear them called the dystrophinopathies. It's kind of a mouthful, and it's because they're both conditions caused by changes within the dystrophin protein. And if you look at the picture here, that colorful picture, that is just a protein complex in the muscle cell membrane. And so there's lots of different proteins in there, and actually if any of those proteins are altered or missing, that's going to result in some type of muscular dystrophy. There's actually a lot of different types of muscular dystrophy. We're specifically talking about Duchenne and Becker, and we're very focused on the dystrophin protein, which is that kind of yellow beaded necklace that you see in the diagram. But that whole protein complex is really important for the muscle cell stability. So our muscles are always going through cycles of contraction and relaxation, so they're working really hard, and that puts a lot of stress on the muscle cells. So if any of those proteins are altered or missing, the muscle cells can break down, and that's what happens with muscular dystrophy. It's kind of easy to think of dystrophin, and in my mind, I'd like to think of it as a shock absorber. That's why I have a picture of the wheel and the blue shock absorber, because dystrophin really acts like a shock absorber. It's there to kind of keep the muscle membrane stable through all those cycles of contraction and relaxation. Another word you're probably going to hear a lot is spectrum. We're really trying to emphasize that Duchenne and Becker are on a spectrum. It's the spectrum of dystrophinopathies, meaning we see a lot of variability. You're probably going to notice that here at conference. On the far left, you have the very classic Duchenne, which has the early childhood onset and a much faster progression. And then all the way at the other end of the spectrum could be the most mild Becker cases, where those men have adult onset, sometimes late adult onset, and a very, very mild or slow progression. But a lot of people fall kind of in the in-between. So, not everyone is at, the most severe or the most mild end of the spectrum. There's a lot of people that kind of fall in the middle. So just the effect on the muscles. So as I mentioned, without the dystrophin protein, the muscle cells can become damaged over time, and they break down, and they're eventually replaced with scar tissue and fatty tissue, and that process is called fibrosis. So you might hear about some of the therapies being developed to combat fibrosis. The pictures here on this slide are actually showing what muscle tissue looks like if you were to look through a microscope. A lot of boys now don't get a muscle biopsy when they're diagnosed, but you may eventually get one if they're participating in a clinical trial. But this is what they would look for in the muscle biopsy. So the top picture is showing the healthy muscle tissue, and that dystrophin protein is stained red, and you can see the cells, the membrane is intact, and you see dystrophin throughout the membrane. But in a boy with Duchenne, that bottom picture is showing what the muscle cells look like, and you can see there's no dystrophin present at all. The cell membranes have kind of broken down, and there's some spaces, that scar tissue space in between the cells. So I know we're talking a lot about muscles, but we do want to really emphasize that Duchenne is not just a disease of the muscles. It actually can affect almost every system in the human body. I'm not going to be talking about all of those changes, but you're going to hear from a lot of other speakers at conference who focus on, the cardiac or the heart aspect or the lungs, even GI and learning issues. So it really is a multi-system disorder. So because I'm a genetic counselor, I'm going to talk with you a lot about the genetics. And again, like I said, you're going to feel like you're back in high school biology, but I think it's always nice to kind of get a solid foundation for some of these terms you're going to be hearing. This picture's just showing a human cell. Of course, our human body's made of millions of cells, but in the center of each cell is the nucleus, and all of the chromosomes are found in the nucleus. And if we could unravel the chromosomes, we would see that DNA molecule. And that DNA molecule is like the blueprint for our bodies. And then each small segment of the DNA is a gene, and each gene codes for something particular in our body. So the Dmd gene codes for the dystrophin protein. But every protein or enzyme in our body has a gene that codes for it. And if we could further unravel that DNA strand, we'd see the 4 DNA bases, the A's, T's, G's, and C's. Maybe you've seen some of those letters on your son's reports or heard about them if you've seen the movie Gattaca, but those are basically the letters, the bases making up DNA. So I'm showing this picture because if we were to line up all of the chromosomes in a single human cell, this is what you would see. It's called a human karyotype. So we all have 23 pairs of chromosomes in each cell. Because of Duchenne being on the X chromosome, the gene is on the X chromosome, we're very focused on that 23rd pair, so that pair in the bottom right corner. Women, we have 2 X chromosomes. Men have just 1 X and 1 Y, and that's really important to understand with Duchenne, and that explains why most women with Duchenne are just carriers, because they have that second X acting as a backup, whereas men, having only 1 X, whatever they inherit on that X, they're going to express. So we'll get back to that in a little bit, but just really want to emphasize that the Dmd gene is on the X chromosome. So something else really interesting about the Dmd gene, if you're a genetics nerd like I am, it's actually one of the biggest genes, if not the biggest gene in the human body. It's huge. It's made up of 79 exons. Exons are just little coding segments within the gene. You've probably seen that terminology on your son's reports if they mention there's an exon deletion of 49 to 50. So they're basically they've numbered all of those exons 1 to 79. that in order for the dystrophin protein to be made properly, all 79 exons have to line up just perfectly to get a protein that's going to function normally. And the space in between the exons is called the introns. That's what's cut or spliced out. So those are removed and all the exons line up together to make the protein. Oops. This is just another diagram. Maybe some of you have seen this. If your doctor showed you this, it looks like a puzzle, but again, just showing all 79 exons and how they have to line up perfectly to form the dystrophin protein. So there's lots of different changes that can be acquired within the DMD gene because it is so huge. It is susceptible to acquiring a lot of changes. There's thousands of changes that have been documented. You've probably seen different names for these. They've been called mutations in the past. We tend to see the word variant used more often. And you're also going to see maybe words like benign or pathogenic. A pathogenic variant means it's a disease-causing variant. But most of the changes in the DMD gene fall into three main categories. There's large deletions. That's the majority of Duchenne and Becker patients. So that means there's an entire exon or several exons deleted. Another more common change we see are duplications. So that's when an entire exon or several exons are repeated or duplicated. And then almost 30% of boys with Duchenne will have a much smaller gene change or a sequence variant. And we'll be talking more about those in a minute. But again, if you have any questions about your child's genetic test report or your report, if you've found that you're a carrier, please come talk to me or Nikki or Kayla. We're the three genetic counselors here. We're happy to review the report in detail with you and explain what it means, because it is like a foreign language. I kind of think it's easy to think of a gene as a sentence, and then each little three-letter word in that sentence is an exon, so it's kind of easy to think like a deletion is when there's a word missing or an exon missing, and a duplication is when a word is repeated. Another change you hear a lot about is a nonsense change. A nonsense change is when there's a premature stop inserted within the gene, so in this case it's like a period inserted way too far in the sentence, so the protein just can't be made properly. There's a couple other types of changes we can see, missense and insertions. Those are more rare in Duchenne, but certainly if you have one, please come see us and we can talk with you about that. So the next several slides are going to focus mainly on boys who have a whole exon or multi-exon deletions, because that is more commonly what we see. But I want to point out something called the reading frame rule, which maybe your doctors have talked to you about. So this is kind of what's supposed to happen. If you, again, think of each of those three-letter words as an exon, all of those exons have to line up together to make a protein that makes sense. In this case, the old dog ran. So that's how everything is supposed to work. When there's a deletion, so an exon is deleted, those remaining exons can't line up together properly, like the puzzle pieces don't fit together, and you end up with the old ran, which doesn't make sense. So we call that an out-of-frame deletion because the resulting protein really just doesn't make any sense and is not going to be functional. Versus in-frame changes you've maybe heard about. With an in-frame deletion, you can have an exon deleted, but the puzzle pieces still fit together well enough to make a sentence that still, makes sense. In this case, you get the dog ran. So in this case, you get some protein made. It may not be perfect, but it's better than nothing. So that's what happens with an in-frame deletion typically, and that's why we usually see individuals with Becker having in-frame changes, whereas those with Duchenne tend to have a more out-of-frame change, which results in no protein production. I do want to point out, though, that there are a lot of exceptions to this reading frame rule. So if you're seeing this and you're like, hey, my son has an out of frame, but I've been told he's Becker, or vice versa, that is definitely possible. We see that. All rules are made to be broken, and there's no exception with this reading frame rule. Something else to point out, you're going to be hearing a lot about exon skipping therapies, and really the exon skipping therapies are entirely based upon the reading frame rule, because the whole point of exon skipping is to turn an out-of-frame deletion into an in-frame deletion. So hopefully a boy who is meant to have Duchenne may end up with a more mild Becker presentation. So in this case, and I apologize, the slide might be a little hard to see, but on the far left, you see what would happen in a healthy individual. All the exons line up and you get the protein made. In the middle there is a patient with a 4950 deletion, and those exons cannot line up properly, so no proteins made. And then on the far right, this is what happens when someone is treated with exon skipping. In this case, they're treating with eteplirsen or Exondys 51. So this is exon 51 skipping. So they can skip over the 51, and then, so they're actually making the deletion a little bit bigger. So they skip over that bordering 51 exon, and then the resulting exons can fit together, and you'll get a shortened protein, but it's still partially functional. So that's what exon skipping is all about, and you'll be hearing a lot about that over the conference. Oops. So I am going to skip back a little bit to talking about the X-linked inheritance. I know I already mentioned this, but I just wanted to discuss it in relation to carriers. So if you did find out that you're a carrier of Duchenne, you've probably already been explained to you, but each time a carrier were to have a child, there's a 1 in 4 chance her child would have Duchenne. I think it's easier to think of it as each time a carrier conceives a boy, there's a 50% chance he would be affected. And each time a carrier conceives a girl, there's a 50% chance she would be a carrier. Having trouble here. Okay, so I realize some of you, since you're newer to this Duchenne world, a lot of times you don't have any family history of Duchenne, and this just kind of came out of the blue and was a huge shock, and you might be wondering what my chances are that I'm a carrier. I think sometimes women assume if they have a son affected that they're automatically a carrier. That's not the case. About 2/3 of the time, we do find out that the woman, the mother, is a carrier. But 1/3 of the time, or about 30% of the time, the mom is not a carrier. And that just means that this new gene change started new in her son with Duchenne. And again, that's, I know it doesn't make any sense to a lot of us, but our DNA, that molecule's always acquiring changes, and because that DMD gene is so big, it can acquire a lot of changes. So it's nothing, you as a mother did or didn't do. These changes just occur naturally. So that's what we call like a spontaneous gene change. Oops. So it's really important to know if you're a carrier. I imagine a lot of you out there have already had your carrier testing, which is great. But if you haven't, I just really want to encourage you to please get your carrier testing done. It's so important for your own health, because we do know that women as carriers can be at risk to have some cardiac complications, and that needs to be monitored closely. It's important for your family planning. If you're thinking about having future children and you want to know, what the chances are that my next child could inherit the DMD gene. But it's also super important for the rest of your family, because if you find out you're a carrier, it could mean that you have sisters who are carriers, or aunts or cousins. So it's really important to meet with a genetic counselor and go through your family history and figure out who all might need to get their carrier testing done. So genetic testing, I feel like I've said this a million times, but it's very important. We know it's super important for diagnosis now. It really is the gold standard for diagnosis. It's really important for family planning and for your relatives, but it's also really important to know for research, because so many of the new therapies being developed are very specific to the variant that your son has. And again, I'm just going to fly through this because you're going to hear from all of these companies at conference, but these are the companies that really focus on genetic therapies. PTC Therapeutics has nonsense mutation read-through, so that would only apply to boys with a nonsense mutation. The exon skipping therapies that Sarepta and NS Pharma have developed, those only apply to boys with certain deletions. And again, we, as the genetic counselors here, we're happy to review your son's report and let you know if your child would be amenable to any of these therapies. And then, of course, for gene therapy, we're going to have a lot of talks on gene therapy. But right now, some of those trials are having to exclude certain genetic variants from the trials. So you'll be hearing a lot more about that. So just to review the genetic counselors we have here at PPMD, we're really here to help you. We're involved in a lot of different programs. The registry and the DCODE program I'm going to talk about in a minute. We're also very involved in the newborn screening program that's been going on. But mainly we're here to answer questions and to provide genetic counseling to you and your family members. So please take advantage of us. We love meeting with families, getting out of our home office and actually seeing you in person and being able to answer your questions. So please come see us. This is the DCODE Duchenne program I think I've mentioned. This is our free genetic testing program. I realize a lot of your boys, I'm sure, have already had their genetic testing, but if you happen to talk to any other newer families in the community and they're having trouble getting their genetic testing, we can provide that testing free of charge. And we also do free carrier testing, which is really a great service for families. And all of the 4 companies listed there graciously support this program and make it possible. So it's really easy to get free testing through DCODE. You either have to be a male with a confirmed or suspected diagnosis, or a female with a family history of Duchenne or Becker. You do have to live in the US or Canada. We're right now limited to just those 2 countries. But all of the testing is performed at PerkinElmer. We make it really as simple as possible. It can actually be done on a saliva kit, so you don't even have to get your blood drawn, but we can coordinate getting a saliva kit sent directly to your home. And yeah, work with you through the whole process. So reach out to us here if you want to get that started. We've tested now over 2,000 patients through the program. Over 1,500 boys or men have received diagnostic testing, and over 750 women have received carrier testing since we started that. So it's really a great program to take advantage of. And then the other program that I really wanted to promote is our Duchenne Registry. I think Rachel was mentioning we have been collecting data through the Duchenne Registry since 2007, so we have 15 years worth of data. It's a self-report data, so self-report registry, so this is something you do on your own. We can help you. We're here to help you get started. But it's really an easy way to participate in research. We actually have over 5,500 individuals who's registered since we launched. We have a lot of countries represented. About 2/3 of our registrants are US, but we have over 115 countries in the registry, which is kind of amazing. One of the big things that we do that I think is super helpful for families like you is that we provide recruitment services. Most of the clinical trials and research studies will come to us to recruit. So we can search the registry and see who appears to match their inclusion criteria, and then send you an email to let you know that, hey, your son appears to maybe match inclusion criteria for this trial, and this is who you contact to get more information. And I think that's really important because there's so much research activity going on in the field, and it's so overwhelming even for us as professionals. So I can't imagine for parents. So it's kind of nice to think, okay, if I get in the registry, I'm going to be notified if there's studies that are that could be a good fit for my child. So our registry is actually now all within a mobile app platform. We transitioned a couple years ago from a web platform to mobile app just to make it more user-friendly. I'm going to fly through these slides because I think I might be running out of time. But yeah, it's a simple interface, and there's even an e-signature form, so you do have to read through the consent in the app. You sign right on your phone. And then once you're into the app, you'll see a whole list of surveys to be completed. They're called the activities. But there's different surveys on muscle function or corticosteroids, heart, behavior and learning. But it's really simple. You just click on the survey, and then each screen has a question. So we've really tried to streamline it and make it as easy for busy families as possible. So why should you join the registry? I know Rachel mentioned this too, but we really encourage you all to become a citizen scientist, which sounds big and fancy, but it just means you can really help advance research like from the comfort of your own home. Even if you think, I never want to be in a trial, that's just not right for me. Just by sharing your data in the registry, you're really helping to move research forward, because we have researchers from all over the world who access that data. It is only de-identified data we're sharing, so we're not sharing your son's name or date of birth or address. But it's a great way to really kind of move the needle forward on research. And again, it's a great way to get specific information on clinical trials and drug approvals. We send out a lot of emails about upcoming conferences or big news in the world of Duchenne, so it's a great way to stay informed. And it's also a wonderful way to kind of give everyone a better understanding of all patients with Duchenne and Becker, as well as carrier females. We really want carriers to register too, because we need more data on carriers. We need more data on Becker. So it's a great way to help us gather that data and really promote research. If you do go to, like, you can just go to the Apple App Store or Google Play Store to download the Duchenne Registry app. You are going to need an activation code. That code you just get from our website. So you go to DuchenneRegistry.org and you click join, and you just have to enter in your email, and you'll get an email invitation which contains the link and activation code. But we're all here at conference, and we'd love to help you through that process. Again, my name's Anne. The other genetic counselors I work with are Nikki and Kayla. We're actually going to be sitting at the resource fair, which starts tonight. We have a table for the registry and the DCODE program, and we have a little incentive for you. If you come visit us, you'll get a Starbucks gift card, so that's always exciting. But you can always reach us after the fact as well at our email and the phone number here on the screen. So that's all I have for you today. I don't know if are we taking questions? At the end. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all for listening, and thank you for coming. We're glad you're here.
Okay, thank you, Anne. That was amazing. The questions are already coming in for you, so. All right, I kind of gave you guys a little bit of a spoiler in that I'm going to talk to you about comprehensive care. I'm also going to try and get us back on time as best I can. So what is comprehensive care? When you get a diagnosis of Duchenne or Becker, it's really complex, it's really complicated. And if you've had one of those super multidisciplinary clinic visits yet, it's probably a little overwhelming, a little confusing, a little intimidating. Yeah, because you see a neurologist, and a heart doctor, and a lung doctor, and a PT, and an OT, and a genetic counselor, maybe a dietitian, perhaps a social worker. It's a lot. One piece of advice, take notes, because we don't remember all of the words that they say. But comprehensive care is really important because Duchenne is one of the most complex diagnoses there is, and it affects every single system in the body. And so that makes comprehensive care really complicated. And so we try to make it as least complicated as possible. So, comprehensive care. Who gives comprehensive care? All of these people. We'll talk about who those team members are. What does comprehensive care look like? When does it happen? And where does it take place? We're going to work through each of these things. Maybe. There we go. Okay. So you're going to see a series of screenshots from our website as I kind of go through this talk for you all, because we try to break it down in a way that it's digestible and understandable, right? Because this is complicated enough as it is. Let's not make it even more difficult than it needs to be. So assembling a care team is really tricky. Finding the right doctor that fits you and fits your family and fits your son. And so we're going to talk through what this looks like, because what your care team looks like at the time of diagnosis very well may change as your son grows, gets older, and his needs and your needs as a family change as well. Okay, so members of your care team. There are 2 slides here. I've already alluded to the fact that there are a ton of people that you may at some point interact with along your son's care journey. So typically you're gonna have your pediatrician or primary care provider, and this is somebody who, you know, maybe did that CK test as you went down this journey, somebody who gives him his vaccines or prescribes his amoxicillin when he gets an ear infection, whatever the case may be. And a lot of times these are people who have never seen Duchenne before, and your son might be the only child in their practice that has Duchenne. That's okay. They don't have to be a Duchenne expert, because you're gonna have a whole team of Duchenne experts that can work with your primary care provider to create this comprehensive team. You also probably have a care coordinator. And I don't love this term because it doesn't tell us exactly who it is, but most of the time, your care coordinator is gonna be a nurse or a nurse practitioner. Sometimes she's a social worker, but this is somebody who, like me in my past life, really quarterbacked your care and wrapped their arms around you and pulled all of these pieces and parts together so that it made a little bit of sense. The person that you call when you have a question about the steroid dosage, the person that you reach out to if your son has fallen and breaks a bone, the person who helps you pull this comprehensive visit together so that you know who the heck you're seeing and what they're going to talk to you about. Some other people that you can come into. Palliative care. Palliative care, I think, gets a bad rap because when we think about palliative care, we think about end-of-life care, and they are not the same. Palliative care really focuses on quality of life across the lifespan. And some of you may have teams that introduce palliative care from very early on, from the time of diagnosis, which is ideal. Others, they usually show up around the time of transition to adulthood, so those teen years. This is a really great service and somebody that I highly encourage you connect with at some point during your journey. Developmental pediatricians are people who look at behavior and development because Duchenne does affect the brain and how we learn. That's something that we'll talk about during conference. Gastroenterology and GU, so stomach intestine care. There are lots of implications. If your son has difficulty potty training or pooping, or you have any poop questions, the self-designated poop king, Dr. Kent Williams, is here this week, and he would love to connect with you. He's also just like really fun too, but he's a gastroenterologist and one of the leading in his field in Duchenne. The neuromuscular specialist, that's going to be a neurologist or perhaps a rehab doctor who's going to be the primary doctor who manages neuromuscular care. This is the person who is prescribing steroids and talking to you about research trials and things that are coming down the pike. This is the person who's going to follow your son's strength and progression over time. The neuropsychologist or psychologist or psychiatrist, these are people who focus on learning, emotions, behavior, developmental care, psychosocial things. And hopefully there's somebody like this in clinic. You're going to hear from a few of these during our care breakouts. So be sure to be in the care breakouts and ask questions about what this role does and how they can be helpful. Sometimes you might see a speech and language therapist or speech language pathologist. This is somebody who early on can talk to you about speech development. Speech delay, very, very common. Many of you in the room probably had a child with a speech delay because that's so prevalent in Duchenne. So early on, they're really great with that. As our guys get older, they're really wonderful when it comes to talking about issues with swallowing and chewing, speech, alternative communication devices. Really, really fantastic group. Orthopedists are people who focus on bones and joints. So if your son has tight heel cords, you might be referred to an orthopedist. As he gets older, he might have scoliosis or a curvature in his spine. You might see an orthopedist. He might break a bone because before they're kids with Duchenne, they're just kids, and kids break bones, right? This is somebody who is a critical part of the Duchenne care team. And then a dietitian or nutritionist, somebody who is going to talk to you about just nutrition, how to keep the weight off or to help put it on. Both ends of the spectrum are incredibly important. Oop. All right, I struggled with this one last time. Can you guys help me go back one? There we go. Okay, endocrinologist, so that's somebody who does hormone care. So somebody who focuses on your son's growth, his bone health, his bone density, puberty, talking about testosterone. A physiatrist, so that's like a rehab doctor. They've got a couple of different titles in there. Really great at focusing on positioning and strength and functioning and range of motion, and they work really closely with the neurologist and the PT. We've got some great ones here. Dr. Sue Apkon is fantastic, and I think you'll have a couple of opportunities to hear her speak. The physical therapist and the OT are going to do things like measure your child's strength. What is his North Star assessment score? You've probably heard North Star, 6-minute walk, 10 or 100 meter. They're doing these types of assessments to measure how strong your son is and then use that information to inform any sort of interventions. So stretching, night splints, things like that. Social workers are awesome. They provide information about resources with education, quality of life, financial, other assistance. They can also do mental health assessments and diagnostics in clinic. So oftentimes, if you don't have a psychologist readily available, they can get that process started, do a lot of those assessments in clinic, and provide that level of support. You've got our pulmonologist and cardiologist, so your lung doctor and your heart doctor. They are critical parts of your care team. A dentist who's going to be looking at their teeth, and then you just heard from Anne, who's a genetic counselor. Really critical to have that genetic counselor who can do, the genetic testing, carrier testing, testing of other women in the family, explain what it means, and help you make sense of some of these really confusing and high-level concepts that are hard to wrap our heads around. Surgeons can sometimes be involved, perhaps if, you have, a fracture and your fracture requires repair, or you've got, something completely unrelated to Duchenne. That surgeon is part of your care team, but they need to be aware of that Duchenne diagnosis and what it means. And then home care companies and nursing. So if you have some level of equipment at the home, you're probably going to have a home care company involved to help maintain that equipment, bring you that equipment, work with you, and in certain stages give you respite and provide care within the home as well. So a lot of people. Really complicated. Let's uncomplicate it as best we can. Okay, so comprehensive care, what is it? What does it mean? What are we talking about when we say comprehensive care? So PPMD partnered with the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, back in 2010 actually, on the first iteration of the care guidelines. And those care guidelines are expert consensus documents that go through what the standard of care should look like in each discipline. What does ideal neuromuscular care look like? What does ideal cardiac care look like? What does ideal pulmonary care look like? And it goes through all of these details. And I'm not going to go through each of those pieces today because we would be here for a very, very long time. But Duchenne changes quickly, and the field is changing quickly, and this is good, but it meant that we had to redo these guidelines and update them with new information, research, practices, and approved therapies. So we did it again and republished them in 2018, and we're having some early conversations now about doing it again. So these talk through all of the different disciplines, and we make them as accessible as we can for your doctors and for you. So here is just like a screenshot of the title. So essentially it's broken down into 3 different academic publications. They are available on our website. Yes, they are dense and heavy reading because they're academic population, or publications rather. So they go through this, part 1 is diagnosis, neuromuscular, rehab, endo, gastro, nutrition. Part 2 is lung, heart, bones, and ortho. And then part 3 is primary care, which was an addition in 2018, emergency care, psychosocial care, and transitions in care of lifespan. So care changes as our guys get older and move into adulthood. What are some of those implications? And how do we promote independence throughout the lifespan and that successful transition to adulthood? Okay, so as I mentioned, these are on our website. You can get the full publication, but there's also some other more family-friendly versions that even I myself prefer over the academic articles, and those are the family guide. I think I have, yep, perfect. So there's a family care guide. So this is something that we created in partnership with some other large neuromuscular organizations, so MDA, Treat NMD, and WDO, World Duchenne Organization. And this is the care guidelines in a much more palatable version that actually makes a little bit of sense, right? So this is available on our website as a PDF, and I think we actually have some physical copies at the resource fair. So if this is something that you want to grab a hold of, let us know. We'll get one in your hands, and if we don't have enough here, we'll mail one to your house so that you can have it. This is a really great way to empower yourself with all of the knowledge necessary to make sure that all of these pieces come together, and we've got some additional tools to support you in that as well. Particularly relevant for this group, the new diagnosis and early care guide is probably my favorite resource that we have available, because a lot of the stuff in the family care guide and in those academic care guideline publications goes from A to Z, right? From the time of diagnosis forever. And some of that's just not relevant right now. If you have a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old at home right now, all of that stuff might not be helpful or relevant or necessary, and it might be a little bit overwhelming. So this new diagnosis and early care guide is going to focus really on those first couple of years after diagnosis. How do I focus in? How do I hone in on what's important and block out the noise that I don't really need to spin my wheels on right now? So this is adjusting to the diagnosis, finding support, what early care looks like, and it also has a really nice introduction to clinical trials, which we have Dr. Nelson here who's going to talk a little bit more about here in a bit as well. Okay, so these are screenshots. We also have these at the resource fair. So these are checklists and the imperatives. So what we did, we took the care guidelines, we broke them up into early diagnosis, early childhood, later childhood, the different stages across the lifespan, and we created a checklist, right? So you can print this off, or we've got paper copies, we can give them to you, and it just takes you point by point through, okay, have I seen an endocrinologist? Have I had somebody evaluate my son's bone health? Have I talked to somebody about steroids? And it creates this itemized list because some of us have brains that just do really well with checklists, myself being one. I love ticking those boxes. Maybe you do too. This might be a really great resource for you. We also have the imperatives. These are more targeted towards healthcare professionals. We have them for both pediatric and adult, but you can see it spells Duchenne down the left, and it is basically an acronym and goes through all of the different care guidelines in sort of an itemized, quickie sort of way. These are really good for your primary care providers who say, I've never seen Duchenne, I don't know how to, I don't know what to do with this. That's okay. That's fine. Let me teach you up. Let me give you the resources to feel empowered for caring for this child. So let us know. We can get you these too and send them to your PCP, and then they've got it, and they've got that information that they need to be more successful. So our website is chock full of information, and it's set up in such a way that you can go by area or stage. So this is just a quick screenshot of what it looks like. You might have already explored it before, but this is showing you how you can kind of go by area. If I want to learn about muscles, I click muscles. If I want to learn about bones and joints, I'm going to click on bones and joints, and it'll give you lots of focused information on that specific area. This is what the early phase and diagnosis looks like. So we try to keep all of our newly diagnosed stuff in one section of the website. There's lots of information that Anne talked about there, lots of information about intro to clinical trials, and that newly diagnosed guide as well. So we try to keep that in one place so that it's not too terribly inundating and overwhelming. Emergency care. Okay. I don't like to believe that they happen, but they do. Emergencies happen. And they usually don't happen out front of your neuromuscular clinic, unfortunately. They usually happen on a Sunday night or on vacation or, you know, the day you're supposed to go, you know, somewhere. And it's just always inconvenient. But emergencies happen. So we want to make sure that you have the resources that you need to keep cool during an emergency. Because if you're anything like me, an emergency happens and I freeze. I have no idea what to do. I just panic. So go to that resource fair today over lunch or sometime during this week. We've got emergency cards that talk about different emergency care guidelines. We've got emergency wheelchair cards that you can put on wheelchairs or backpacks that are waterproof. They are super cool. We've got PJ's Protocol. PJ's Protocol is a fantastic document that talks about how to handle stress dosing and emergency implications around steroids. If your doctor has not told you and your son is on daily steroids, you cannot stop daily steroids, and you really can't miss a dose either. That can be really dangerous. And so we want to make sure that this information is available in a way that is concise and makes sense. Surgery and anesthesia precautions. So this is also part of those emergency care guidelines. Surgery and anesthesia looks a little bit different with Duchenne. There are certain drugs, there are certain anesthetics that are not safe for people with Duchenne and Becker and for carriers. And so this is included in those emergency care guidelines, but it's also available on our website. It's in our PPMD emergency care app. So if you don't have the PPMD app on your phone, download it, please. It's wonderful. I have it on mine. And then we also have a really great emergency campaign that we're launching here this week. I'm not going to get too much into it because I don't want to steal my colleague's thunder, but we've got some really cool stickers with QR codes that you can throw on a binder, a wallet, backpack, whatever, so that these emergency care guidelines are readily accessible to you because, again, if you're like me and you freeze, you're like, I don't know what to do. I'm going to scan my QR code, and I'm going to have a little bit of guidance on how to move forward safely. I already showed you guys this map. This is the map of the certified Duchenne care centers. If you do not go to a certified Duchenne care center, I'm not saying that you're getting bad care, but I'm saying that if you do go to one, you're getting great care. A lot of families don't live near one, and if you are not sure if you live near one, please come and find me. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out where you're getting care and if there's an opportunity for you to access a certified Duchenne care center. These centers go through an incredibly rigorous certification process. This isn't just a quickie stamp of approval. This is a really, really long process to make sure that these centers are providing really spectacular care for your family. So if you have any questions, if you're not sure, if you want to ask about a doctor or a hospital, come find me. We'll talk. All right, and we launched this a few months ago. So connect with PPMD's care team. So you've met me now. My name's Rachel. I'm a nurse practitioner by training. I was at Nationwide Children's for 5-ish years before I came to PPMD about 3 years ago. So I've taken care of a lot of families with Duchenne. I have some amazing teammates too. So Alexis Hazlitt is a nurse who was the nurse coordinator at the clinic at Children's Mercy in Kansas City. She's fantastic. She does a lot with resources and connecting families, problem solving, access, things like that. And then Amanda Wilkeson, who's also an ICU nurse who's on our team and has been with PPMD for a very long time. You can schedule time with us whenever you want. We'll hop on Zoom. You can call me, you can text me, you can email me. There is no question too big, too small, too silly, too serious. We are your team. We are here for you. We never want you to feel alone. And when those emergencies happen in the middle of the night or on vacation or after hours, we do our absolute best to be accessible to you and to help you navigate these things. So please know that we are here. If you go on our website, you can actually schedule a Calendly appointment with us and choose which type of appointment you need. So are you talking about newly diagnosed stuff? Let us know. If you want to work on school stuff, you've got questions about IEPs, 504s, school accommodations, let us know. And that way we have the right people on the phone to answer your questions and help you problem solve. All right, how am I on time? Is it really bad? It's not terrible. It's not terrible. Okay. All right, so at this point, I am going to get off the stage and hand things over to Dr. Stan Nelson. I gave a little intro of him earlier, but I will let him do a full intro himself. And he is going to talk about understanding clinical trials and how to listen. And then after that, we'll do a Q&A. So if you have questions, keep writing them down. And then after Stan, we'll all be up here and we'll dig into all of your questions. Thanks, guys.
Very good. Thank you, Rachel. I'm Stan Nelson. I'm at UCLA. I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy at UCLA, and I've been coming to this conference now for many years. My other role here and in our clinic and in my life is I'm the father of a now 21-year-old man, I guess, still a boy, with Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy. He's here, and you'll see him with his aide who traveled with us here today. So he's approachable, reasonably social, chat with him. But I would just, I think just before I jump into this, you all are new to this world, and I'm sorry for that. And definitely brings me back to the early days when my own son was diagnosed. He was diagnosed at 3. And it's transformative. It absolutely changes your entire world's perspective, and it's a major change. However, life goes on, and I think it is very much as the other Rachel was saying, is that your life is still good. There's still joy. There's still a lot of interactivity to have, and it's just a different path, but it's a very human path to have. The other perspective is I'm actually quite thankful for Pat for having formed PPMD and the other families who've come together to sort of make this work. And it really is it's a family effort, it's a team effort, and it's been ongoing for quite a long time. And it's really quite impressive to see. When Dylan was diagnosed at 3, there were no clinical trials for him to participate in. 0, didn't exist. There was certainly interesting research going on. Very good, skilled researchers had been working on understanding the molecular approach of DMD, and then how do we move forward with clinical trials was really starting. And there had been an effort in the 80s to look at drugs that were already known, sort of really repurposing issues. But sort of the era of taking new therapeutic approaches directly related to Duchenne was just emerging, and I think this enterprise has had a lot to do with that. So, thank you, Pat, and really from the bottom of my heart, I think it's really quite amazing. So, the other perspective here is this talk. When I shared the title of this talk with my wife, she burst out laughing. She says, "You're going to give a talk on how to listen?" So, that reveals something about both of us, I believe. Anyways, so, I'm going to give you a bit of a perspective. Clinical trials are enormously broad, and I'm going to give you a bit of a perspective of where we're at the moment in clinical trials, and try to give you a little bit of information about how you might be thinking about it as you're deciding what, how, if to participate. But I also would just say that one of the things that I enjoy about my colleagues at UCLA and other clinical sites that are part of these care networks is they're clinical trial aware. That is, clinical care used to just be, take your kiddo home and love them. And then it was, organizing, care aspects that can sustain children to young adulthood and beyond. And now there's therapeutic interventions, but those therapeutic interventions are going to be changing year over year. It wasn't in 2016 that the very first Duchenne drug was approved by the FDA, and this actually dramatically changes how clinics practice over time. So even what therapeutics we take and agree to do for our children may change what clinical trials your child might participate in. So it gets fairly complex pretty quickly, and it's actually already complex for you guys in terms of what you're going to need to consider. The phases of clinical trials, there's this mountain of things going on which are going to amorphously be called the preclinical space. This is all the ideas that people have, all the thoughts people have, all the different ways that people are working in actually cellular models, molecular models, and mice often is the go-to organism to study as a fairly similar to humans organism. And then when ideas are sufficiently mature that there's a mechanism that's understood, that there's good safety data in at least 2 animal models. So often that would be a mouse, most commonly for a small, and then a large animal, often a dog or a primate. Those 2 are needed to have sufficient safety data to say, okay, it's all right to give our very first humans a drug. So then we would give the first drug to the first human. In many clinical trials, it's not given to actually a child or an adult with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's given to a healthy adult for the very first single-dose studies. And those fit into a somewhat broad category of phase 1 clinical trials, which is really first in human clinical trials. We don't know what the drug does yet, never before been seen. And there's a whole cadre of humans who volunteer for those studies, even without a disease. So it's really even a broader team effort than just what we do here within our own Duchenne world. Some clinical trials can't be done that way because it would be unethical to be treating healthy, often healthy young adults in a phase 1 trial. So sometimes those are done actually in population with a disease. So you'll see some phase 1 clinical trials. Often there'll be dose ranging, going from low dose to a middle dose to a high dose to try to figure out in very few people, often 3 people in each dose cohort, what's the dose that we can get to in humans that's tolerable for humans. And then phase 2 is really all about fine-tuning that dose ranging, getting more safety data, establishing what the dose is that you want to test for efficacy, and then test for safety as well. So again, these are relatively small studies, almost always done actually in the disease population for phase 2 studies, and there's many opportunities for phase 2 study participation. And then phase 3, that term means typically that it's a double-blind placebo-controlled trial because that's the gold standard for proving that a drug works. So you would actually have a group of kids getting a placebo or an inert agent, trying to match it as best as you can. That's not always possible to do, depending on what the clinical trial type is. But that's the gold standard because if you can prove it in that situation, you control for a lot of variables by having a very tightly compared control group. And this is how most drugs actually are approved in the US. So there we go. So the way this looks like to most of the pharmaceutical industry is, the massive preclinical data. Most leads that are considered possible therapeutic targets are dropped before they're even ever brought into humans. And then in phase 1, it's typically tens of people testing the very first drug for the first time. Then it's hundreds of people in a phase 2 study, then thousands or even tens of thousands in a phase 3 study. That's normal drug development and takes years to do. Duchenne doesn't exactly look like that. So for the human safety, sometimes the phase 1 are actually done in Duchenne boys or young adults, and that's tens. And a phase 2 study would typically be in the tens range of individuals as well, so not expanding to hundreds. Can't think of a single example of a phase 2 study that expanded to hundreds, but I suspect there's one. And then in the phase 3 trials, we actually have drugs approved in the rare disease space with as few as 8 individuals, and a drug was approved in the Duchenne space with actually 12 individuals having been treated for years of time. But in general, the studies are comparing tens of individuals to hundreds of individuals. So it's still pretty small by drug development standards, possible to do in Duchenne, but it creates this issue of there's now dozens of clinical trials, thousands of patients at different ages with different severities, and different sensibilities and different mutations. And so this mix and match creates challenges for the companies. It creates challenges for you to decide what to be on. And making that more efficient is a goal for all of us. So I'm very bullish on all of us participating in clinical trials as much as we reasonably can. Dylan has participated in 4 sort of research natural history studies and 3 drug trials during his childhood, basically. So that's not an atypical Duchenne experience these days. So this is just to give some perspective on where we're at. So if you consider what the literature looks like for Duchenne, if you just go to PubMed, which you can all do, put in the word Duchenne and ask how many papers have been published since 1962 to now, there's 14,325 papers, which is a rather vast literature for one relatively rare genetic disease that's now actually rather well understood, but incompletely understood. We actually still have a lot more to learn about Duchenne, and we have mysteries. Mysteries abound. Even in the clinical trials, we have mysteries. And you'll see that throughout the time here. So a lot more to understand, but this is kind of that churn that I was talking about in terms of before the clinical trials. This is where a lot of that information is published and comes from. And then many of these then become leads for therapeutic approaches for how you'd go about treating. Almost all of these are tested in a mouse model, not all in the MDX mouse, which is a mouse that has Duchenne. It has a nonsense mutation in exon 23, if you care. And if you just look for treatment, there are thousands, there's a couple thousand published papers. Many of these papers actually never get published because if the results aren't even minimally exciting, it's a little hard to publish. So, but there's a couple thousand such experiments where people have tried to treat mice with various issues. And this is that preclinical world. Even going from some mode of, this is just a few examples. This is from a postdoc who was in the lab a few years ago. And you can do this over and over again, but this is just 4 examples of things that we're sort of moving towards clinical trial. But it takes years often from the first insight of a small molecule or drug you might be repurposing or a good idea that you have, that it's impacting something that's related to DMD pathophysiology until it's actually even assessed in that mouse, right? So it's just a long time period that occurs to make that work. And that's because even those experiments, even the clinical trials on mice, are difficult to do. They're time consuming. They're often a couple year long experiments. This is where we're headed, and this is very exciting. So it's actually 400, if you put into PubMed and put in the word Duchenne, which is Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there's 404 publications that are publishing clinical trial results, or they might be in the middle of a clinical trial, but it's actually a very impressive number. There's dozens published every year, and this is growing at an increasing rate every year. Some clinical trials started in the 60s. Somewhat more meaningful trials started in the 70s. A real organized effort occurred in the 80s. And I think we're back to that far more organized, but really an era where we're pushing for company or industry-sponsored clinical trials, which is going to get new pharmacologic agents through FDA approval. So anyways, it's a pretty large landscape of publications to sort through, and it's a bit challenging. With all that, we are in an era where drugs are getting approved. So 2016, an exon 51 skipping drug got approved. 2017, a deflazacort that appears to be, it's a decent alternative to prednisone, was specifically approved for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. 2019, a second exon skipping drug. 2020, a third exon skipping drug. 2021, a fourth exon skipping drug. And these look like this because each time we get a drug approved, we create a little bit of a runway. So the runway for how to get an exon skipping drug approved is established. That is, if you have an exon skipping drug and a boy has no dystrophin and you give exon skipping and a few months later or a year later, there's some dystrophin induced it is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And that's a route by which we can give accelerated approval through the FDA and allow that drug to be administered to boys in clinics. So there's a growing cadre of that type, and that's actually a very important biomarker for many of these studies. So it's an exciting time, lots of things moving forward in a way that's very promising, but still a reasonably small number of drugs. And most specific mutations aren't yet treatable with any of the exon skipping drugs. And all of us would like exon skipping drugs to be more effective than they are currently. So these are not complete solutions by any stretch of the imagination. There's also, and I suspect we'll actually probably hear about some of these during this trial, but there's an ongoing release of phase 3 trial data. We should all be alert to these and also be a bit resilient to negative information. We should presume many of these clinical trials are going to fail to be successful, fail to be of help to our children, and that's okay. We wouldn't want people to have to only do a trial that they know is going to be successful, because then we'd really be doing very few clinical trials. And instead, we really want to set that rheostat to, we're all engaged in an experiment jointly, communally together. We're willing to take the risks for our children are willing to take the risks, and that at the end of it, we may prove communally that a drug is not effective. And that's very valuable because we're moving on to the next thing. So those are, psychologically a bit difficult to wrap one's head around, but absolutely key is we're still doing an experiment in humans, in boys, in children with a serious disease. So our Duchenne clinical trials always have fewer patients than typical clinical trials. Also, the patients have various different disease courses, that everybody's on exactly the same trajectory, and I'll show you a slide of that in 1 second in terms of why some of the clinical trials will be restricting boys in specific ways, particularly during the ambulatory years. And that's because some differences in patient mutation may change sort of the severity of the disease over the course. So this is a plot. This is actually a North Star ambulatory assessment. I don't know if anybody's had it performed on your child yet. You probably have. It's a 17-item scale. It takes a physical therapist or a physician about 15 minutes to do in clinic. It's taking up a step, down a step, sitting, doing a sit-up, lifting your head, standing on your heels. So 17 similar things. You either get 0 points, 1 point, or 2 points. 2 points if you do it without any adjustments. And it turns out that when you do this type of study, we can do this with a 6-minute walk test or pretty much with any measurement of physical strength. And this is what Duchenne looks like, is that in the early, clearly it's not a laser pointer. Anyways, I'll point there. The dark line here is the average of North Star data, largely from a UK consortium where they published their North Star data. It's from a paper from reasonably recently from Francesco Montoni, who's a very well-known physician scientist in the UK, aggregating these data. So if you took everybody's data all together, at the age of 4, the average North Star value, a measure of strength, a typical 4 or 5-year-old would have 34, which is the maximum score. So that's right at the very top. But at age 4, the boys are on average lower scores than they are at 5, and lower scores than they are at 6, and about the same as at 7. And this is seen across a lot of the clinical trial data when we're looking at kind of the placebo group, the inert treated group, or we're looking at natural history data. So this isn't unique to this data set. This is just a general thing. So if we put a boy on a drug at 4 and looked at how they were doing at 5, even if the drug's inert, they're probably going to be doing better because most boys do a little bit better at 5 than at 4. We carefully measure the muscle function. We did the same experiment at 5 and then looked at 6. They're also going to be a little bit better. So it makes it challenging for the drug companies and the clinical trial designers to design clinical trials that separate out when you have an effect and when you don't have an effect. And what it does inevitably is it forces the clinical trial designers very thoughtfully to create restricted clinical trials. So this is going to be a dominant thing as you're asking questions about a clinical trial. Is my child going to be the right age? Is that clinical trial coming up where my child will enter a window where that is going to be relevant? Is my child about to leave a window where I can no longer be part of a clinical trial? And those are quite painful decisions sometimes because it's a moving window, your child's moving through a progressive disease, and you're kind of hitting a target, right? So those are frustrating things. They're done for a good reason. And this, I just threw on one company. I won't even mention the company's name, it doesn't matter. But this is a criteria that they set with a higher limit of the North Star, a lower limit of the North Star, which are in blue, and then a lower age, and then a higher age in green. So if you're not within that box, your child cannot be in that clinical trial. And I just took data from our own clinic from a different clinical trial that we were doing and just plotted what the North Stars were before people were even in a different clinical trial. And many of the kids, about a third to half the kids, don't qualify even though they have Duchenne. So the reason to do that is they're trying to find a homogeneous group where when they treat the kids either with placebo or not placebo, they'll have more of a consistency to minimize the natural variation that we see in boys so that they can see a difference. So these things then influence your decisions and your thoughts about how and when to participate in a clinical trial. Many of the clinical trials as well also require kids to be on steroids because we know steroids have a very large effect on mitigating the disease throughout lifespan. And so it's something important to talk about early on with your clinicians in terms of starting on steroids so that your child is clinical trial eligible as you move towards that. So lots of considerations to think about in clinical trials. This talk is actually quite broad, so forgive me for just touching on it in some ways. But do consider kind of that length of time that you're committing. You're not marrying the clinical trial team, but you are agreeing to abide by the clinical trial rules. You're going to jump into that. You're going to do it faithfully as best you can, but you can leave a clinical trial. You're not necessarily mandated to stay in it forever, but you should enter it with the idea that you are going to try to complete all of the issues. Part of the reason for that is we certainly don't want clinical trials where we're biasing the results, where people are dropping out periodically, and that makes it very difficult to analyze the data, so then it slows the whole process down. So look carefully at sort of what effort and commitment you're going to have to do, what sort of tests are needed, are biopsies needed, are open biopsies needed, are core needle muscle biopsies needed, are MRIs needed? Can your child go in an MRI scanner? Can they do some of the tests that are required just in terms of, even the North Star can't be done very well on every single child if they can't listen to instructions or follow the instructions. So some of those things you'll be tailoring and choosing how to spend your time and energy. Consider the impact on other family members. We have clinical trials where people were coming in once a week for an infusion for a few hours every week for years, right? It dominates what families do because instead of going to a volleyball game, you're going to go in for infusion. I prefer an infusion to watching a volleyball game. Don't tell Carrie's family that, but that's how I feel. But everybody's preference is different, though, I will admit. But it does change, and it really creates these administrative burdens for your family along the way. Also ask about, is there a likelihood, is there a possibility of being on open label extension? So if the drug is having an effect, it's good to be able to stay on it, and that's useful data for the companies to collect. But if the drug is demonstrated to not be effective, they won't be able to keep you on open label extension because they're giving you an experimental product, not demonstrating that it has any benefit at all. And at some point, that becomes actually unethical. So we've had instances where people have to stop the drug, even though that one family may think that it's beneficial. Ask about what other options are available. There's dozens of clinical trials available right now, not necessarily for every single age range and not necessarily for every mutation or severity, but there's many, many options. Some of those will be geographic. A clinical trial won't be necessarily offered at every clinical trial site. Ask about and be proactive about, are there other therapies you should not start prior to considering that you might want to be in a clinical trial? And are there other therapies that you should start so that you're eligible for the clinical trial? And these all have to be done months and months in advance of actually enrolling in a clinical trial. So steroids would be an example of that. And then do clarify with the team, it is an experiment. You have, as the guardian of your children, you are able to leave clinical trials. That is not verboten at all, but try to sort of plot things out so that that's less of a likelihood. So my comments at the end of this are, keep in mind clinical trials are experiments, and we don't know the answer. If we knew the answer, we wouldn't be doing them. Sort of enter it with that attitude in mind. We expect some of the clinical trials to be therapeutically beneficial, and certainly across the whole enterprise, they're unequivocally beneficial. Boys are unequivocally benefiting from the last 30, 40 years of work that's gone on in Duchenne, and we want to just keep that momentum and moving forward. They're really the only ways that we ever get to test if a drug has an effect and if it's safe for any sort of new therapies moving forward. So they're critically important to the overall enterprise, and I think we're in a pretty healthy place right now. Your engagement in clinical trials is going to be personal. We're not going to get everybody involved in clinical trials, but if it's possible for you to do, it's great to do. We have biases in who can participate in clinical trials. It's not equally easy for families to participate. So we have work to do on our end to make clinical trials easier to participate in. And I think keep pushing us on that, because I think if there's barriers to you participating, it's good for the site investigators to know, and we can share that with the sponsors who are eager to try to enroll their clinical trials as fast as humanly possible. And we should be mindful of that. And it is complex when you're dealing with a long-term childhood disease like Duchenne. I think that other part is done. Okay, thank you, sorry.
Okay, there we go. All right, Stan, take a seat. Anne, Rachel, and myself, we're all gonna come up here and do a quick Q&A. I know that we're over time, so we'll take the questions and we'll go 20, 30 minutes or however long you all need of us. I know Ryan had at least one question that came in from online. So maybe Ryan, you could get us started. And then if you have questions, there are mics in the aisles up on the stands. So please do not hesitate, ask questions. There is no silly or stupid question. Whatever is on your mind, we would love to dig in. Ryan, do you wanna get us started?
Yeah, I have it.
Perfect.
This was a question for Anne. Does the specific genetic variant give us any idea on how the disease will progress?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really varies. We still have a lot to learn in what we call genotype-phenotype correlations. So that means how we can correlate the gene change you carry versus a possible prognosis. Like I said, we're still gathering a lot of data on that. We do know for some deletions, they've been associated with a milder progression or those children being able to walk longer than we would typically expect. And then we've seen the opposite with some deletions that behave differently. They tend to have a faster progression, but there's a lot of deletions that we really don't have that information on, and it's quite complicated because we've seen individuals even within the same family, so they have the very same deletion, present very differently, which, it's frustrating because it makes us realize we don't really know as much as we think we know. But we do know that there's some modifying genes, so we all have hundreds, thousands of genes in our body. So kind of our background genetic makeup, we think could be playing a big role in how mild or severely affected a child is. And there's a lot of research, and in fact, Stan would be great to talk about that, but there's a lot of research focusing on modifier genes and what could be, causing some children to be more mildly affected or more severely.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say that often the mutation is very clarifying. So, most DNA mutations we can plot out generally what the course is going to be. So there is a lot of information in the genetics of the DMD gene, but there are nuances along the way. And sometimes I would point out that the genetics isn't everything exactly, as Ann was saying, and we have worked away from doing muscle biopsies on the kids, which is the right thing to do for diagnosis. You're still diagnosis, and actually I'm talking with Anamika earlier, is your child's course is going to be your child's course, but sometimes a muscle biopsy is actually quite clarifying because it can let you know if there's residual dystrophin. We do see individuals who can have natural skipping, and they can have restoration of actually far more normal looking muscle architecture than we'd have expected. So I think there's going to be, there's probably about 10 to 20% of the kids who actually would benefit from having a muscle biopsy for these clarifying issues.
Absolutely. Hulda? Yeah.
I'll just speak into the mic. Hello, hi, my name is Hulda and I'm from Iceland. And I do feel like this question is very silly, but I'm still going to ask it. I have a son who is amenable to exon 51 skipping. And we have been fighting for 5 years or more to get him into a clinical trial. And, I've done everything that I think that I can. I've built, a great network. I have so many friends helping me and doing all the things that I think need to be done. But here I am still with nothing. So I hear a lot of things from people. People will say, call the trial site every day. Just do, I have a question. Just what do I do to better my chances? My son is a good candidate. He's on steroids and, I think is doing really well and fits all the categories. But, living in a foreign country, living in Iceland, it seems that it's just impossible to get into a clinical trial. So just kind of speaking for parents who are not here in the States, I don't know, what do we do?
Yeah, I would say I don't know. I mean, just in terms of being from another country. And so I think I've got that kind of egocentric, American attitude, just because the world's pretty complex, even from where I sit.
That's why I came up.
and it's a great question, though. But we do have patients who've traveled from around the world, not from as resource-rich of a country as Iceland, but Iceland's small, right? It's not a big population. There's not a huge group of boys with Duchenne possibly living on the island. In which case, it's there often is the possibility of traveling, but then it's quite right. That's a whole nother level. So we've had people move during the era of early exon skipping. We had people move to LA to participate in a clinical trial.
We would do that in a heartbeat, yes.
And then you're there. And that is possible to do. There are not restrictions necessarily on nationality, but then it creates a different wrinkle of kind of this immigration rules and how long you get to stay, and sometimes you have to go back to check in. So it's not at all simple.
So you think that maybe could be a factor that we are not admitted there, or kind of just putting us at the back of the list because it's more complicated than?
And because there's probably one boy in all of Iceland.
Yeah, he's the only one in Iceland that can have that treatment, yeah.
Yeah, and that's very painful, I think.
I just wanted to let that be heard, because you were talking about it, thinking about all the
right,
terms.
and if there are other exon 51 skipping trials opening soon with some maybe second generation variations of an antisense oligonucleotide attached to something, and there's multiple companies working on that space. So there may be opportunities to participate in trials that might not be an every week infusion, but maybe an every month infusion. Mm-hmm. And then it might be more palatable to take a really short flight to New York or something,
Yeah,
or to the
kind of what I
UK.
was just wondering, do you guys think that it is helping that, you call every day, you write emails, and you kind of just pressure, that is something that helps?
I think so. Making me aware of it, I think, helps a little bit. Making the companies aware of it helps. It's sometimes quite difficult for them to work across international boundaries for
That's a
some of these
barrier we
things.
need to fix, yes, for sure.
Well, that's even something
Thank
that we, the Royal, we PPMD, we bring up these issues when we talk to our industry partners to ensure that we're reaching as many families as possible. And unfortunately, we don't reach every single child, and that, quite frankly, it sucks. Pardon my French. But I think, you raising your voice is important because it makes other people aware who also raise their voices, because our collective voice is much louder than one singular voice. And so while I don't have a solution for you, I hope that you know that we are on your team.
Thank you. It's good to get the chance to at least say it. Thank you.
What other questions? I'm sure you have some.
Hi. So my question is, we're 4 months into diagnosis. Do you have any tips for parents in the initial care team that you can already tell it might not be the best fit, about how to start that conversation with the care team when you don't have like the nurse kind of care coordinator that you spoke to, Rachel? Just kind of how to start that when you just, every appointment you feel frustrated and kind of leave with way more questions than you got answers to, which, I mean, is common in this, but you just can tell that this is not a great path already.
If it's not the right fit, then we find the right fit.
Okay.
Right? So I came from a really large clinic. I'll be super transparent. So I was at Columbus, really, really large clinic, and we had several neurologists. And it was always kind of amusing to me because the physicians at our hospital were all world-class, famous Duchenne doctors, and some families had really strong opinions for one physician or for another. And I think that speaks to the importance of finding the right fit, right? Because these doctors can all be amazing, but that doesn't mean that they're the right doctor for you and for your family. And Stan might even have some comments on this too, being in the clinic. But you need to find somebody who makes you feel heard and who you're not afraid to ask your questions. And I would say 4 months in, first of all, kudos to you for being here. I'm really glad you're here. You're certainly in that phase where you're gonna have so many questions, but you're also in this place where you need to find somebody who makes you feel empowered and encouraged and lifted up, like you're not alone in this journey. So let's connect after this, and I wanna hear a little bit more and see if we can help you find somebody who is going to meet those needs.
Yeah, and I agree completely. I think the first year is just really tough, right? I mean, just no question about it. The world has just shifted on its axis. And I think it's critically important to get your questions answered for sure. So I would definitely bring that up. Just that putting my clinical hat on, sometimes it's difficult to know how much information to share and when to share it. And that's true on the day that we give the diagnosis back. It's true the next visit, it's true the next visit, it's true the next visit, because the disease is shifting over time. So the information that you need to function and sort of need to wrap your head around is different at age 3 than it is at age 6, than it is at 10, than it is at 20. And my own personal attitude is to share more rather than less. And honestly, I don't believe that works perfectly for everybody I talk to because I suspect I overwhelm them, right? So I think I'm one of the, I think Rachel would probably comment, I may be one of those people who use, we use jargon, right? We don't talk in a normal way. And we don't necessarily highlight the information that you're really asking. So I think, if it's a place with just a single physician, you're only meeting with that physician and that physician can't explain it to you, then it's very worthwhile to try to figure out where the right fit is. But keep in mind is, 4 months is super early. And I would say don't feel like you have to settle everything or sort everything out for your child's whole life within that first few months, per se.
Rachel, I'm sure you have some insight here.
Yeah.
How would you help these families advocate for themselves in these situations?
It's a wonderful question, and it's a tough question, but I think if you can articulate the things that you value as a family to anyone working with you, that's a really good way of aligning what you need most with the people who can give it to you. So being clear about what makes you excited as a family, what do you want to do, what makes you get it hopeful, what gives you hope, what makes you proud, and then focus on those things and then find someone that can align with your values as a family. Thank you.
We had a family one time who, yes. I had a family one time who came in at diagnosis and the mom looked at me and she said, my husband and I were accountants. We're data people. I don't need them. I don't need the emotional words. I don't need the soft words. I need you to tell me exactly how it is. And I was like, okay. But it empowered her medical team because we knew how to talk to her in a way that made sense for her and for her family. I've had other families where we just need to sit and cry together, and that's perfectly okay too. But I can say, being on the HCP side, being on the healthcare provider side, we will not be offended if you say, talk to me like this or help me understand like that, because it only helps us do our job better. Yeah, what's your question?
Hello, my name is Justin Green. We're also very early in our diagnosis. Our son has deletions of 8 through 11, and I know currently he's not eligible for any gene therapy, so I'm just trying to find out more information if there's ongoing research for figuring out kids that have deletions 1 through 18.
So many of the kids who have mutations in that early part of the gene are some of the kids who our genetic crystal ball is more murky with. So, some have mechanisms of starting to express the dystrophin protein later and actually making a partially functional protein. It's an area where when we look at the, when we have a piece of muscle in hand and we can look at the RNA directly and the protein and the sort of the whole cells and the mixtures, they're violating the rules that we think we understand. So there are some things that are possibly worthwhile to do. Those kids will be excluded from this current round of the gene therapy. It doesn't mean that they're going to be excluded forever or that the teams working on gene therapy won't be able to figure out how to deal with a concern that's always been a concern as we've moved forward with the gene therapy is if you're missing the protein genetically and you put the protein back in, you could get an immune response to the protein, and that could actually make you worse than having gotten the gene therapy. And there's been some, examples of that, which is kind of the reason for the exclusion. So it's really a safety exclusion at the moment. But there are other, there's dozens and dozens of other clinical trials that are not targeted to just that dystrophin restoration part. And it's quite possible that, how old is your son?
He's 4.
4. Yeah, so things that are very helpful, even at 4, is a North Star measurement. How strong is he at this point? What's his CK level? And did he ever have a muscle? He probably hasn't had a muscle biopsy yet. Yeah, and there might be reasons with your care team to consider that, partly because I'm a bit of an, I'm a bit of an outlier in the Duchenne space for this one issue, so I'll just say that as a caveat. But I will be influenced by how much dystrophin a child is making in terms of how aggressive to be with things like steroids, or even exactly what clinical trials would be most meaningful and impactful. But I think for practical purposes, I'd put kind of the gene therapy things out of your brain for years and focus on other clinical trial options, just for practical issues. But
Thank you.
Okay.
I just want to add to that, if you're interested in learning more about what trials could, be coming up for your son, you can sign up for one of the one-on-one sessions that we're offering during conference. You have to go to the app. I think it's under the More section, where you can access the one-on-one sessions, and you can meet with a genetic counselor, and we can kind of, look at your son's age and ambulation and variant and determine what trials that are recruiting now or possibly soon in the future that could be a good fit if you're interested in learning that.
All right, looks like we got a question over there.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gloria Orozco, and I'm very glad to be here finally. I've been trying for years to be in the conference and one thing or another. Well, one of the programs that I admire the most in PPMD is the certified centers. My son, he goes to Colorado Children's Hospital, and thank you, Pat, Kathy, Rachel, everybody, they made that possible. And every single one, especially newly diagnosed parents, if you have the opportunity to attend one of those centers, is the best thing is going to happen for your children. It's not easy. It took me a couple years to get my son to Colorado because I live in New Mexico, but it's possible. I've seen a lot of parents as well with older children, and they really concerned about certified centers for adults. It's a trend. I follow some of the media, some of the. And the question is like, my son is turning 18, or my son is turning 21. And then, we've been in this certified center. It's been wonderful, but it's a lot of uncertainty to what's going to happen when they turn into adults. So I don't know if you guys have some plans to eventually certify some centers for adults. That was my question.
Thanks, Gloria. That's a great question. We do have 2 adult certified centers. So when we look at that map of the US and all of the certified Duchenne care centers, the vast majority of them are going to be pediatric hospitals. And the reality behind that is that we used to think about Duchenne as a pediatric illness, but the landscape now is very different. These men grow well into adulthood and get married and have careers and need adult providers and have adult health problems separate from Duchenne. So in 2019, we certified our first adult-only, just an adult certified Duchenne care center. That's the University of Missouri. So Mizzou out in the Midwest. So they are an adult certified center. And then we also have a dually certified center at Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore, Maryland. So they have that dual designation of both pediatric and adult. But that doesn't mean that there's not good adult care out there. And I think that it gets a little bit tricky because somebody might not have a designation, but that doesn't mean that they're not doing great work. So we have a good handful of clinics throughout our CDCC network that were certified prior to us creating that adult designation, right? So Nationwide Children's, they will keep you through lifespan. Iowa, Cincinnati, they keep you through lifespan. And so I'm just ragging on them to fill out their paperwork so that I can give them the title because we know that they're doing the work. So if you have a question about adult care, where to get it, what it looks like, let me know. And there might be more to it than meets the eye. I think it's really tricky too because adult care is structured differently. And so oftentimes adult care can be really difficult. And so some centers will make you transition to an adult facility when you're 21, 24, 26. I was at Vanderbilt. I think they require their guys to transfer neurology service when they're in their early 20s, but then they just keep their cardiac patients. So the cardiologist keeps the patients, but then they transition. Like, it's really complicated, and it's more complicated than perhaps it should be. And so that's something that we definitely recognize and are working on. But thank you, Gloria, for bringing it up, because it is really important, and it's something that's on our mind.
Hi. My name is Nicole, and thank you all for everything that you're doing and for being here today. I just was wondering if you could maybe touch on, and I'm sure there's going to be sessions about this, but any of the trials that are in phase 3 that you're most excited about, or that, yeah, look promising.
Yeah, and I can start. I think, certainly the fact that we're in an as a side before I jump into this, that there are many, many clinical trials, and we, in general, it'd be great to populate all of them, because that's how we'll sort of have the whole spectrum. And I would say, many of us in the field longer than I've been are very excited to see where gene therapy, really a micro or a mini dystrophin, companies are calling it slightly different things, can go, a shortened dystrophin that can be placed back into the cells and expressed then for years is really very exciting. And it's exciting because we understand the molecular basis of Duchenne. The dystrophin is missing genetically, and we can measure it and we can observe it, and then there's a lot of downstream consequences from that, as Rachel was showing. And restoring dystrophin to the skeletal muscle or heart muscle can go a long way to mitigating the disease process. We've already seen some of the data come out from those gene therapy trials, and they're not curative, right? It's not like the disease has suddenly completely gone away. There's a group of boys, as the one father was just mentioning, who are going to be excluded from those clinical trials because of their mutations. So it's not one size fits all. And even in that one category, if you're too young, you can't participate. If you're too old, you can't participate. If you're too mild or severe, you could also be excluded from some of those. So I'm sort of most excited to see what that looks like. Part of it is, it is the cause of Duchenne. It's the cause of the cascade of events. Replacing it is so fundamentally important that it's almost foundational in our world, right? If we can do that, can we make it better? Can we mitigate the other cellular changes? If boys have already had fibrosis, if they already have an immune infiltrated, they've already had a lot of muscle damage for years by the time that we're doing this, can you remodel the muscle? Can you change the muscle, having restored dystrophin to the skeletal muscle? And those are unknowns, and it's unknown why it's not just, even more effective than it appears to be with the early data that we're able to see from the clinical trials. So those are exciting things, partly because we're tackling the actual root cause of the disease. So that's why I think most people are kind of in that mode. But I would, because it's not completely correcting the disease, it really is begging this issue of what other ways have clever scientists considered that are going to be complementary, augmenting in combination or solo with that fixing and restoring some dystrophin back in. So I think it's excited for this, begs the question of other things, begs an understanding of what happens when you put dystrophin back in, what's the muscle look like. So it's going to beg lots of scientific questions along the way. And then the other part that I note that you're aware of is as well, if we can make exon skipping much more efficient, that could be similar to sort of the amount of dystrophin that's made that we're observing the companies are reporting from the micro and mini dystrophins. And those may be more functional proteins. There's the preclinical data indicates these microdystrophin and mini dystrophins are actually pretty darn functional proteins. But can exon skipping in some instances actually create a virtually full-length protein? It can in some specific genetic instances. So I think, the areas where you're attacking the root cause of the disease are most exciting to me, but that's partly my own bias in terms of being a geneticist. And I think it's an exciting era to be in, that we can fix we can kind of fix the root cause of genetic diseases for the benefit of the patients during their lifespan is pretty remarkable.
We're going to hear some really great updates these next few days too. We've got a couple of plenary sessions that are going to be phenomenal. I have like little bits of info that I know that are going to come that I think will be really exciting, as well as, hearing from each of our industry partners and in our late breaking session too. So this is like the meeting where we get all of these updates and we're able to, update everybody about what the newest, most exciting stuff is. And so get your pen and paper ready because it's going to be some good stuff, and there will be plenty of opportunity for questions during those sessions as well. I want to be mindful of time. We're at 12:30, and I want to make sure that you all have time for a breather and for lunch. So unless there are any last-minute questions, okay. All right. Guys, thank you so much for being here today and joining us and letting us come alongside you and give you this Duchenne 101. We're really grateful that you're here. I hope you all have an absolutely amazing few days with us. Come find the PPMD team, ask us questions, whatever we can do to make your experience absolutely phenomenal, the better.
So lunch is in K. And also, please stop by and get a T-shirt because we're doing a picture tomorrow, and you'll see staff that are going to just hand you a T-shirt, ask for your size, okay? So lunch is in K. Thank you very much.
And then back here at 2 o'clock, is that right, Ray?
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock. Thanks, guys.